This is Belarus, and this is Russia. Right now, they're best of buds, but within 5 years, their relationship status might be getting a little bit more complicated. That's because Russia has an insane plan. A leaked document from Vladimir Putin's executive office recently revealed that, by 2030, Russia fully intends to backstab Belarus and take full control over their government, their military, their education, and their economy. Which might just be one of the most Russian things ever. But why is Russia so keen on changing its relationship status with its favorite girlfriend? Since starting his war with Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has increasingly found himself with fewer and fewer friends, owing largely to his failed foreign policies and his ever-growing, seemingly irrational ambitions. In just over 1 year, Putin has managed to cripple Russia's entire economy, pushed some of Russia's closest neighbors into joining NATO, and has caused the onlooking world to lose much of their fear of the Russian military, as they watched one of the most televised wars in all of world history, and saw with their own eyes as Russia repeatedly failed to achieve basic military objectives against an opponent less than half its size. These failures have caused many of Russia's international allies to begin looking at Putin with raised eyebrows. But rather than reading the room, Putin has instead chosen to show the world exactly what kind of man he is, by shifting the blame onto his most trusted advisors, which might help explain why over 30 high-ranking Russian officials and oligarchs have disappeared or been found dead under suspicious circumstances since the start of the war. In light of all of this chaos, Putin's closest friends are starting to feel more than a little bit nervous, leaving Putin with few people he trusts, and even fewer people who trust him. And in this world where even Putin's inner circle doesn't seem to be immune from regular rounds of Russian roulette, perhaps there is no one who should be more suspicious of Putin's plans than Russia's closest international ally, the small nation of Belarus. If you're not familiar with Belarus, it sits on Russia's western border, just north of Ukraine, and very close to the Ukrainian capital city of Kyiv. It's roughly the size of the state of Kansas, and is home to a population of 9.3 million people. Importantly, like Ukraine, Belarus was formerly part of the Soviet Union, before it dissolved in the early 1990s. This has given Belarus an interesting relationship with modern Russia, or, more accurately, it's given Vladimir Putin a serious case of ex-boyfriend syndrome, as he has made it his life's mission to bring the Soviet band back together under Russian rule, behaving like any gentle-hearted ex-boyfriend would, and attempting to woo Russia's ex-girlfriends back into his loving arms with tempting offers. Offers like threats of military force and economic punishment if they don't comply. Quite the ladies' man, Putin is. And let me tell you, this Eastern European international romance turns out to be even more dramatic than the last season of The Bachelor. With so many mood swings and overnight betrayals, you'd think Russia was being run by the Kardashians. Case in point, it now appears that Russia has been attempting to use Belarus for its own purposes in Ukraine with the intent of weakening them, so that Russia can then turn on them after they have gotten what they wanted, and dissolve Belarus into the Russian motherland without a fight. One big, happy family. And the leaked document mentioned at the beginning of this video is far from the only proof of this. If you have watched the war in Ukraine unfold, then you know that Russia has had no ally they could count on throughout this conflict like Belarus. From the very beginning, the two nations have stood hand in hand, with Belarus being one of the few nations in the world to support Putin's actions, acting as a spokesman to relay Russian propaganda, and as a launching ground to allow the Russian military another point of access into Ukraine. However, despite this, up to this point, Belarus has denied Russia one key thing. They have repeatedly chosen not to involve the Belarusian military directly in the war, being willing to aid Russia, but not to risk Belarusian lives. That's going to come into play in just a minute. During the initial invasion of Ukraine, battalions of Russian troops entered the country directly from Belarusian territory, which allowed them access to the shortest land route possible to the Ukrainian capital city of Kyiv. This was of immense strategic importance to Russia, and, theoretically, this alliance with Belarus should have allowed them to capture Kyiv and overthrow the Ukrainian government in a matter of just a few days, making the Russian-Belarusian relationship extremely valuable. As we now know, that's not what happened. But what did happen was something very interesting, something which revealed Russia's intentions from the very beginning, to those who were paying attention. On their way to Kyiv, Russian tanks did something very unexpected. something which didn't make sense at first, and which caused a huge amount of confusion in the chaos of war. That's because rather than flying Russian flags, certain columns of Russian tanks were apparently seen flying the flags of Belarus instead, fraudulently implying that the Belarusian military had joined Russia in arms in the conflict, a line which Belarus was not yet ready to cross. This is a big deal, because if Ukraine would have taken the bait and believed that Belarus was attacking their territory, it could have put the Belarusian people directly in the firing line of a reactionary assault from the Ukrainian military, leading to a prolonged war on two fronts for Ukraine, with the Belarusians, rather than the Russians, being forced to bear the majority of the casualties, serving as a shield to occupy the Ukrainian military near the capital while Russia shored up its defenses in the east. This could have given Russia the pretense of victory in Ukraine with a relatively small number of Russian losses, reducing the number of coffins coming back into Russia and effectively moving the consequences of the war out of the sight of the Russian people, thus shoring up Putin's reputation as the invincible savior of Russia. More than that, this would have given Russia a pretense to fulfill the next part of their plan to restore the former borders of the Soviet Union, as they used the suffering of Belarus and the need to help with reconstruction as an excuse to enter and dissolve the country. Scary stuff, and there are even more reasons to think that Russia tried to bait Belarus into the fight than just this. In early March 2022, Ukraine reported that Russia had fired on Belarusian settlements from Ukrainian territory, trying to convince the Belarusian people that Ukraine was attacking them, and thus drawing Belarus into the conflict. Belarus denied these claims, but we'll see in a minute why these denials shouldn't necessarily be believed. Fast forward to February 2023, and this series of events seems to be continuing. Towards the end of February, Ukrainian intelligence officials revealed that they had spotted Russian convoys with unmarked military equipment wearing Ukrainian military uniforms near the Belarusian border, leading them to conclude that Russia was planning a series of attacks on Belarus that would appear as if they came from Ukraine. Up to this point, these attacks haven't happened, perhaps partially because after Ukraine revealed the plan, Russia was forced to realize that the jig was up. But in either case, there are more than a few credible claims of Russia trying to bait the Belarusian military into the war. So the question is, why would Russia do this? Well, it's not as if Belarus has an extremely formidable military that could help Russia change the tide of the conflict. Sure, for a country their size, Belarus does have a decent number of soldiers, with around 65,000 on active duty and around 290,000 in reserves. This isn't nothing, but at the same time, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to what Russia could deploy on its own, since Russia has over 1.15 million active duty personnel and over 2 million in reserve. If it was more manpower that Russia was after, they could simply pull in their own soldiers without needing to involve Belarus, which raises the question, why are they so intent on getting Belarus involved? Well, it all goes back to that pesky document we mentioned at the beginning of this video, which leaked Russia's secret plan to overtake the Belarusian government before the year 2030. This document is sort of a smoking gun, and Belarus would do well to pay attention to its claims in light of the actions Russia has already attempted over the past year. Essentially, the document lays out a plan for Russia to progressively gain more and more influence in Belarus until they can eliminate Belarusian independence entirely, under the pretext of a merger, making Belarus a formal part of modern Russia. This is so shocking because even though Belarus is a close ally of Russia, with many shared cultural traditions, that doesn't necessarily mean Belarusians want to become Russians, much like Canadians don't want to be merged with Americans, even though the two have a lot in common. Having similar goals doesn't mean people want to give up their freedom. And so while Belarus is close with the Russians, they still want their independence, and have been very clear about that over the years. Apparently, though, Russia doesn't care. Their plan is simple. First, Russia spreads pro-Russian sentiment in Belarusian politics, while also helping to undermine support for Western democracy and Belarusian nationalism that promotes independence. Then, Russia makes moves to align Belarus with its currency and its electrical infrastructure, tying the Belarusian economy directly to Russia, and giving Russia the ability to cripple Belarus overnight if they step out of line. Then, given the shared economic status, Russia plans to make it easier for Belarusians to hold Russian passports, boosting the number of Russian compatriots living in Belarusian territory. Throughout all of this, the leaked document also says that Russia should exercise increased control over the public information distributed in Belarus, and establish a common approach to the interpretation of history. And a common approach to the interpretation of history sounds like a nice way of saying that we want to rewrite history so that we don't sound like the bad guys anymore. In other words, they'll both share the same false historical facts. All of these details are chilling, because this is not the first time Russia has carried out something like this. In fact, this is a proven playbook that Russia has used in the past to quietly take over sovereign territory from other independent nations, including Georgia and Ukraine. The utilization of passports in particular is especially worrisome, because it bears striking resemblance to what Russia did to try to justify their recent Ukrainian invasion. First, Russia hands out passports to local people to expand their influence in the region. Then, when the time is right, they point to all the people with Russian passports in the area and use their rights as a pretense for further intervention. That's because once Russia establishes enough passports in a region, it's easy for them to create propaganda that says its own compatriots are being persecuted, giving them a justification to invade and defend them, usually by conveniently taking over regions that are full of valuable natural resources. Because, let's be honest, it was never about the passports. But the question is, would Russia really pull a repeat of Ukraine and invade Belarus? Well, not if they didn't have to. In fact, the leaked document is pretty explicit that Russia wants to overtake Belarus through non-military means, relying on coercion rather than all-out war. Russia's preferred strategy is to make other nations their puppets, and to get them to concede to their demands until they can annex their territory without a prolonged conflict. This has worked in the past, such as with the annexation of Crimea, but the main reason nations concede to Russia is not because of an overwhelming sense of patriotism, but rather due to the fear that they have no other choice, because they feel undefended and unprotected, not wanting to provoke the wrath of the bear. With this in mind, perhaps the best way to make Belarusians feel undefended, and to coerce them into fully joining the Russian state, is to bait them into a war with Ukraine, where their military is crippled, something which benefits Russia in multiple ways. And perhaps this could explain why Russia has been accused of staging so many false flag attacks on Belarus. It may even explain why Russia hasn't made another attempt to capture Kyiv, because, with it so close to the Belarusian border, perhaps at this point they would prefer to bait the Ukrainian forces defending Kyiv into a conflict with Belarus instead, softening both of their targets for annexation at the same time by playing them against each other, and clearing the way for Russia to walk in and pick up the pieces to restore the old Soviet Union. Once this was done, Russia's new borders would then give them a strategic location for incursions into Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, paving the way for continued illogical and pointless campaigns of reconquest, just so that Putin could show a different flag on the map. And if you don't think Russia is deceptive enough to try something like this, then you just haven't paid attention to the last 200 years of Russian history. It might be an insane plan, but with Vladimir Putin, insane doesn't mean unlikely. Now, this all seems pretty clear, so the question is, why doesn't Belarus do something about it? Well, maybe they're trying to. Deep down, I think Belarus is too afraid to say no to Russia, which is why they've partnered with them so closely throughout the war. But there are also indications that Belarus does suspect Russia's long-term ambitions, and because of that, they have done everything they can to prevent themselves from sending their military into the fight. They know that committing their troops will likely spell the end of their independence, and so they have resisted as much as possible. There has been a comical exchange for the past year or so, with Vladimir Putin continually going to the Belarusian president and demanding he commit Belarus's military to Ukraine. But Belarus's president has continually told Putin that he just needs 3 more weeks. 3 weeks pass, nothing happens, and the cycle repeats itself, as Belarus continues its attempts at self-preservation. The problem is that Belarus can't say no to Putin forever. That's because the Belarusian president, Lukashenko, is considered by many to be non-legitimate, with Putin being one of his only major international backers that has allowed him to stay in power. In the year 2020, Belarus held an election where it is widely believed that Lukashenko won by fraud, resulting in massive protests as Belarusians took to the streets and proclaimed that the election was stolen. In response to this, Western nations, including the US and EU, no longer recognize Lukashenko as Belarus's legitimate president, Lukashenko was only able to maintain his power because Putin sent in FSB officers to aid the Belarusian KGB and put a Russian police force on standby to aid in quelling the riots. Subsequent events with Russia using Belarus as a launching point for its invasion of Ukraine have revealed Putin's motivations for doing this. But Lukashenko knows that Putin could withdraw this support at any time, and so, no matter how he plays things, his time and power is coming to an end, either by the hand of Russia or by the hand of his own people if Russia withdraws its support. At this point, he's just trying to buy time. For their part, the Belarusian people are also putting up stiff resistance to joining the invasion. According to Chatham House, 79% of Belarusians would not support Belarusian deaths in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Around 33% of Belarusians do support the war, but of those, less than 3% would want to get actively involved. Even more interesting, close to 1/5 of all Belarusians actually support Ukraine's side in the conflict, seeing Ukraine as a brother nation that they would never want to invade, similar to the way the United States and Canada have long viewed each other. And Belarusian support for Ukraine isn't just in words, but also in actions. At home, many Belarusians have made it their mission to disrupt Russian supply lines, doing things like sabotaging their own railways to prevent Russia from using them. And many Belarusian volunteers have even joined the conflict on the side of Ukraine, so many that a dedicated Belarusian battalion was even created. Some even estimate that there are currently more Belarusians fighting on the side of Ukraine than there are Belarusians fighting on the side of Russia, which is quite the irony. And what's also ironic is the mission of the Belarusian battalion, who has been given the specific goal of helping to defend Kyiv, the exact opposite of what Russia tried to convince the world of when it attacked Kyiv with tanks bearing Belarusian flags. Far from wanting to become part of Russia, these Belarusians feel that they are fighting for their own independence by standing with Ukraine against Putin. And so, like every other part of this conflict, Putin's master plan appears to be falling apart at the seams. Far from being absorbed into Russia, perhaps this is just the beginning of Belarus's freedom from the tyranny of their own dictator, and with him, his pull towards Russian influence. Just another example of how Putin pushed too far and shot himself in the foot while trying to satisfy his own greed.